Good morning. As the rest of the panelists are coming up to the stage, I wanted to take a minute to welcome you to this exciting conversation and also introduce myself. I am Amy Hepburn. I am the CEO of the Investor Leadership Network. The Investor Leadership Network was formed during the 2018 G7 and is comprised of 13 of the largest institutional investors across the G7, both asset owners and asset managers who are committed to sustainable finance and have a focus specifically on making really targeted impact on climate, diversity and investment, and sustainable infrastructure. The collection of asset owners and asset managers within each of our areas, this is a big week for us, as you can imagine. In our climate area of focus, we're committed to creating tools for investors to realize our commitment. So I know this is going to be a conversation of the panel today, is that investors are raising their hands at rapid speed with their commitments, but do we have the tools and the willpower to realize the commitments we're making across the gamut? And that is one of the things the ILN is committed to doing, is making sure our investors have those tools. We're launching our toolkit today on reaching net zero, taking into account the transition frameworks of our investors across the board. In our diversity work, we are committed to inclusive finance. We just launched an initiative called Inclusive Finance 1.0 last year, where our membership got behind metrics that we're looking at engaging with our portfolio companies across the concept of inclusion. So, of course, taking into account diversity, but really diving into what inclusion looks like. How are you bringing talent into the door? And then how are you integrating it into decision-making and making it material for your companies? And then on our third area of sustainable finance and particularly infrastructure, we've been focusing heavily and working with our panel moderator here on blended finance. How do we, as institutional investors, unlock capital in emerging and frontier markets, and how do we do so in a material way? So with our work at the ILN, I have had the tremendous pleasure of working with Hubert Danso, who is moderating this panel here today, and have the privilege of introducing him. Hubert is with Africa Investor, and he single-handedly has done an amazing job pushing our investors to think differently across our three areas of climate, diversity, and blended finance for meaningful impact, to move beyond the platitudes of making a difference to actually the actions and impact that are going to be material, not only to our investors from a fiduciary perspective, but also for the people and planet we are looking to impact. So I personally am looking forward to this conversation today. And Hubert, thank you for moderating, and thank you for being here. And thank you on behalf of the ILN for all the leadership you have shown us in both your thought leadership, but also in your practice. Without further ado.
Thank you very much, Amy. Very kind of you. But the reality is I get pushed by everyone in this room and people in the ecosystem. I think there are some incredible leaders out there that don't get the recognition that they deserve. So I really thank you and salute you all. But I think that's a different job that I have today. So this morning, I just want to welcome you to this Net Zero and Asset Owners panel on how asset owners are responding to net zero. This particular panel is designed to assist CFA's global membership and asset owners understand the dynamics, the impacts, the best asset owner practice when developing and implementing net zero strategies and policies. We have a full range of issues that we really want to address here, such as how we see net zero generally, its legal standing, and the broader policy and legal and regulatory framework, the internal adoption processes, the nitty-gritties of all of that. And we're going to be looking for our esteemed speakers to really give some inside views on the do's and don'ts, on how to internalize some of these particular strategies. And we're also going to canvass our panel's views on their hopes from COP27, that's up and coming, going to be the African COP. So we'll discuss also the impact of the current energy crisis and how far and fast asset owners should move away from fossil fuel assets when facing rocketing energy prices and the winter that hopefully won't be one of discontent. So to address these feast of issues, thankfully, I'm joined by an elite and distinguished panel of authorities. namely Sophia Bartholdi, who is the net zero lead at the Church Commissioners for England. A little round of applause. I know it's very early in the morning, but I just want us to know that we're here, know that they're here. Thank you very much. Jake Barnett, who is the Director for Sustainable Investment and Stewardship at Westpath. Thank you. Sophia Chen, who is the CIO at Cathay Life. Welcome. To my direct left, we have Pedro Galzo, who is the CEO of the UN Joint Staff Pension Fund. And we have the last but not least, the non-asset owner, but he calls himself a geek, but I think I should call him a geek of this. He's the data guy, the data science guy for us. Frederick Samama, who is the head of strategic development at Sustainable One S&P Global. Great, so let's just get straight into this. So I'm going to ask all of our panelists to really just give us their views and share with us about, how they see net zero and what's its real legal standing in, their own jurisdictions and as it relates to their global portfolios, and just really just give us that insight there, because sometimes when you speak to an asset owner and you talk about net zero, they tell you about a legal challenge that's just come about what it even means in itself. But let me just start with you, Sophia with the F, to give us your views. We have a Sophia and a Sophia. So Sophia F, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I don't know if I think it works now. So I think to start with, so I'm from the Church Commissioners for England, so we're the endowment fund of the Church of England. And the way that we see climate change or net zero is a part of our responsible investment framework, where we see three main systemic risks. So we have climate change, we have inequality, and we have nature degradation. And when we look at what we can do as investors to either manage our exposure to these risks or have a positive impact or positive outcome towards reducing the risks generally, we see net zero as one of those tools that we can use there. So for us, our net zero target is partly a signal to send to the world to say we support a net zero pathway. So that's a signal to policymakers that they should make policy on this. It's a signal. It benefits us when we speak to companies, when we speak to our managers, that this is the direction of travel that we want to see. And then it's a way of us to look at, or it's our first environmental objective of the fund. So the rest of our responsible investment work has really been looking at our risk exposure. So this is the first time that we now have an actual environmental objective. And we kind of see net zero as the overarching direction of travel. We don't know how to get there. We can't get there if the real economy doesn't get there. We're exposed to the real economy. We're not a country with specific boundaries or a company with specific factories that we control. We are an investor and we're exposed to the entire world. So we don't have the control to decarbonize the world, but we can choose how we invest. We can choose how we engage, both with policymakers and with companies, and then we can choose to invest more in solutions. So I'd say that's kind of how we view our net zero commitment. And then from a UK perspective, we have quite a lot of regulation around climate. So we have CCFD reporting, which is more the risk exposure reporting, has become mandatory for pension funds. We're not a pension fund, but a lot of our asset owner peers in the UK will have to report on CCFD. And as part of that, they need to set targets. And there is an increasing amount of kind of not regulation, but talks within the regulators around how companies and investors, when they set net zero targets, what is their transition plan? So I think we do have the fiduciary duty kind of pushed back in some ways to say that we can't disregard financial returns, but we also do have push to say, okay, you need to do more. You need to kind of consider climate change both as a risk, but also consider your transition plan and how that aligns with the UK's net zero target.
Thank you very much for those comments. You said something really interesting, which is that you recognize right up front that you can't have net zero if the real economy is not net zero. So it'd be interesting if you maybe could share your views about how you look at scope 3. I'm presuming in some respects scope 3 is a close-ish way of getting to that sort of value chain, corporate value chain wide real economy impact. Are you linking it in? Is it a central piece of your net zero planning and thinking?
I think it is. So, as everyone else, we don't have kind of the specific data. I don't think that stops us from knowing that the oil and gas sector has very significant Scope 3 emissions that are probably the most important thing to address. We do have a motion that the governing body of the Church of England put in a motion saying that by 2023 we need to divest from all oil and gas company or all fossil fuel companies that are not aligned with net Paris next year. So we have engaged a lot with oil and gas companies to try and turn them around. I think beyond that, Scope 3 is we can do a lot of carbon accounting, but you need to understand where your main emissions are and what you control and where your main levers are. And you have control over your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and you can have influence over your Scope 3 emissions. So I think it's pushing, or when we engage with companies, it's to understand how they view where their Scope 3 emissions are. I think they're incredibly important, but I don't think we should stop acting before we have to.
Completely agree. Jake, over to you to answer that seminal initial question.
Yeah, similar. So my name is Jake Barnett. Westpath is the pension fund for the United Methodist Church. We work a lot with the church commissioners and other groups, so I'd say some of our thinking is fairly similar. One of the distinguishing points that I just illuminate a little bit more is that internally we differentiate between how we talk about our investment model versus how we talk about our engagement model. When it comes to our investment model, interpreting fiduciary duty, we have to have a really clear-eyed clinical look at what the probabilistic scenario is for the next several years and talking to our investment managers. We can't invest 20 years down the road saying that this is what we expect to happen. Something I heard from a CIO once that I really appreciated is, if you're too early, you're not early anymore, you're just wrong. So we are trying to be very level-headed within our investment portfolio. We have found multiple mechanisms to green the portfolio. We collaborated with BlackRock in creating the transition ready strategies. We have multiple strategies within our portfolio focused on solutions. But then I would say within engagement, you can be more assertive as an asset owner trying to create that long-term future of what you're looking for. And we have a few different mechanisms that we do that through. We're active in Climate Action 100 Plus. I co-lead 4 different engagements for CA 100 Plus. We also co-lead the engagement track for the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and we think that those type of collaborative alliances, especially amongst asset owners, is a really important initiative to take part in. Happy to speak to that work a little bit more down the road. And then we're also trying to contribute to industry goods like the Transition Pathway Initiative, a really important research project emanating out of the UK that's giving strong data for the transition readiness of different companies. So multiple different levels to hit net zero. Within engagement, we think it's firmly within our fiduciary duty, because the way that we think about it is that most of our returns over the long term are going to be driven by the systemic returns of the market, not the idiosyncratic returns of any singular company. So we feel a need at Westpath within our fiduciary duty to try to address some of those systemic risks in a systemic way.
Just talking about that systemic risk, emanating from the actual market and the architecture of the market in many respects. What's your philosophy there? How do you actually get to that?
Yeah, so one of the best indicators of how we're thinking about that is a paper that we co-authored with the other co-lead of the engagement track, Patrick Parrott, Allianz, called The Future of Investor Engagement. And The Future of Investor Engagement is a paper that came out in April of this year. And the focus of it was saying, if you are committed to net zero, good luck trying to do that company by company in engagement. 8 to 10,000 companies, trying to get them to move in any sort of punctuated tandem way towards net zero is really just a silly idea if you're involved in engagement. You know how difficult that is. So what investors need to start to do is to think through what are the systemic stewardship levers that build on the important but insufficient foundation of corporate engagement. And what we outlined was moving towards sectoral engagement. So engaging instead of a singular oil and gas company, bringing oil and gas companies together with regulators, value chain operators, identifying some of those strategic roadblocks that are stopping greater action. From there, you can often identify policy blocks that need to be addressed in specific markets or global markets. And then as an investor, you should call for those policy blocks to change, be adapted, be removed to accelerate a transition to net zero. And we think especially for asset owners, more focus needs to be put on engaging your asset managers to make sure that they're representing our long-term systemic interests in the way that they're operating in the marketplace.
No, that's a fantastic approach. We have similar parallels in the African continent, where there's always this view that, okay, if we want to invest more in the continent, show us the projects. Where's the bankable projects? But if you have an inadequate legal and regulatory architecture to be able to deploy capital at the scale and ensure that it can get to the projects at the speed that you need it to, aligned with the climate science, then you shouldn't really be looking at the projects. You should rather be looking at the enabling architecture. So there, we're actually having to create our own sort of model law for asset owners called an institutional investor public partnership, which is, I suppose, the asset owner's version of what the multilateral development banks created in the form of a public-private partnership, the traditional PPP, although that tends to take about 9 years to get a serious project done. So we know we don't have 9 years, but no, really great points there. Over to you, Sophia, for your points.
Thank you. My name is Sophia Cheng. I'm the Chief Investment Officer for Cathay Financial Holdings, which is the largest financial group in Taiwan. We run the biggest life insurance, biggest asset manager, second largest P&C insurance. We service about 60% of population in Taiwan. We don't buy ESG funds. We think ESG is a belief and culture. So I value asset manager who can share with us their ESG integration process, their climate action, their participation. So we are also a member of the Climate Action 100 Plus, which you just mentioned. Myself is in the Asia Advisory Board. I am also the chairperson of Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, which is kind of partner with Ceres here as Global Investor Coalition. We were one of the 8 founding members when it was established in 2016. We have more than members from 11 countries and markets in Asia, representing more than $35 trillion assets. So since 2014, I led the responsible investment team. We have done a lot of work and just on climate and low carbon transition related. In 2017, we were the only Taiwan group in Climate Action 100 Plus, which we gathered 700 investors representing $68 trillion of assets. We engage 166 companies in the world. They represent 80% of the industrial manufacturing companies. There are 33 in Asia, 3 in Taiwan, and I'm very honored to share all of them have committed to net zero. We take them engagement as very important because I remember engagement this word when I was before the whole project. I thought engagement means getting married. So I finally realized engagement, you need to think them as a partner. They deserve to know, and you learn together with them. They show me industry insights. I show them global progress, and they always care more than you about their future. So once they know, they will do a lot faster than we thought. We are also the early in TCFD. 2 years ago, when I was choosing water and biodiversity, I thought biodiversity is too wide. People can do greenwashing on that. So we did join Ceres Valuing Water Finance Task Force. The initiative has launched in August this year with targeting 72 companies in the world who are high water user and water polluter. So it's worthwhile people can participate that. We also participate in Asia Utility Engagement Program. We are seeing very good progress. So today, we are the first bank in Taiwan granting money to first solar power plant, first offshore wind power plant. We have already accumulated $7 billion of low carbon investments. And we also passed, I think we are number 6 in Asia, passed the SBT, the science-based target. because I think we need science to decide. And this is first time in my whole life I see scientists are so keen to do the research which is workable for real world, where this is the first time we see corporates and investors are required and become committed to use scientific analysis when they move to a net zero transition. And we are very, very famous on engagement. And one thing I want to share is on the net zero myth. Many people think net zero is very difficult and it's impossible. But think back 20 years ago, no one would imagine your iPhone can become a mini computer. So do not use our past 20 years experience to predict future. And people like Bill Gates and other people are investing in future low carbon transition projects and climate tech solution. So I have very good faith that we should work together to push the net zero pathway. Net zero is so special. It's unlike regular CO 100 plus, renewable 100%, which we also commit. Something you can do today, you can set a time frame and the level of target you want to achieve, where no one how to get net zero. The net zero to me is a commit to aggressive commitment, our ambition that we want to move together to the target because the planet is eroding so quickly. Human beings are using 1.5 times the resource faster than the natural bio capacity itself. This is a simple math. We are going to ruin the planet. So I think with a target of A+, we work very hard together. At the end, even if it's not zero, it should be quite close to zero. So don't make zero magic number become an excuse not to think, not to start. And it's always good to start with somewhere we are good at. If everyone do a bit of where they can contribute, and we start to link together. And today, many stakeholders know other areas well. It's much easier for scientists, NGO to identify whether we are doing ESG washing or greenwashing.
No, thank you very much, Sophia. My wife always told me that the engagement was what's going to keep us married, that period. So I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I learned not to respond to everything. But very specifically, congratulations, gracious me, you've been able to bring so many different constituents together. And I'm sure there are a number of people in this audience that are still trying to get it in one institution. And you're talking in the hundreds that you've been able to get to commit to net zero. Can you just break that down for us just a little bit? What was your experience there? I mean,
number one, people deserve to know. I never think that we have the AUM means anything because that's not my money. It's my client's money, right? So when we go to a corporate, especially the high emitter, they tend to be large companies. They have high ego. You need to go there, show them you come with good intention. And I am very nice. If you don't listen to me, some other foreign investors are going to come here and they will be very harsh. And you see many institutional investors, they will come to the AGM and say, we represent this big of asset. Actually, in Asia, corporate care about being respected. If you make them feel lose face, they will be silent, say nothing, polite, but they will not going to see you anymore. So we pick the most difficult one that very hard for institutional investors to visit, like the Formosa Group, which is the largest petrochemical group one of the largest in Asia, and they have 7 affiliate companies. I always like to choose the top project. And so if you ask your global CIO to go with you, everyone will say yes. But they always send a head of stewardship or manager say, we represent this. No, I go there, and of course, in the beginning, some of their junior members will be very harsh to me. But I tell them it's your future. As an investor, I make decision on investment. It's your decision what you want to do. And if our value eventually align, then we will be engaged forever. But eventually, if this is a global trend, and I start to worry more about stranded asset beyond just the core power plant, so I will keep updating the information to them. We even translate document for them easier to report to their top management. And we will thank to the top management how great their team are learning and making a progress. So they will feel being recognized by their big boss, and they will be more willing to talk to us on their bottleneck. And then once I see that, I can ask my friends in the global network, are there any good solutions? And we'll bring to them, they will tell me this does not work in Taiwan. And I understand why, and I solve the problem for you because your problem is always my problem. Without solving problem for you, I should not ask you to do anything. So by this mentality, we are building more friends than being someone like a very harsh parent to the companies.
Yeah. Fantastic. No, that's absolutely right. I think you've almost given a reverse engineered description of how to address scope 3, because we tend to sort of say we come from a partnership environment where we're always talking about coordinating things, and we always sort of impress upon people that we should be thinking at this day and age, given all of the metrics, about being more correlative. What can I do that will impact you, and what can you do that will impact me? And that is how we're beginning to de-demonize in some respects scope 3, being that someone's scope 1 and scope 2, which is what 30% of the emissions reduction, is someone else's scope 3, which is that gargantuan 70%. So that I really do like that point. But in terms of values and representing the world and looking out for the future, I think the UN, which has convened us all here in New York, is certainly the institution. And of course, Pedro, you representing the members' pensions, it would be great to get your view on this.
Thank you, Hubert. And thank you, Hubert, for the invitation. And of course, it's difficult to add anything after listening to all my colleagues here, right? But so I'm Pedro Guaso. I am the CEO of the investment side of our pension fund. We have a structure in which we have two sides on our pension fund. The operations headed by Rosemary McLean. She takes care of bringing the money in and paying the benefits in. And what I do is I manage all the portfolio. We manage a portfolio of $80 billion. And of course, diversified in all asset classes all around the world. As Hubert alluded to, there are high expectations about what we do when it comes to sustainable investment and the alignment to sustainable development goals, right? And that is why I just want to touch very briefly on two things. It's what do we do as individual organizations, and what can we do? And my colleagues already made reference to this. How can we leverage on partnering with others, right? Because climate change is not even a systemic risk only. It's an existential risk, right? And I think that it's now without any doubt. I think that you are all convinced. Probably there are people out from this room that they're still not convinced that it's an existential risk. But since you are here, you believe that this is an existential risk.
I think after they've heard from Sophia, I think we're all believers now.
Yeah. So since it's an existential risk, it's not something that one organization or two organizations can solve together. We all have to solve it together. So first, let me tell you what we do as an individual organization. Because as I said, we know that there's a higher expectation from us to walk the talk or show with example or whatnot. And we have a very simple strategy, the one that most of you should have. One is exclusion. We were very bold and we divested last year $2 billion of our portfolio that was related to fossil fuels. That allowed us to decrease, of course, our carbon emissions by 40% in our portfolio. And we made that decision because I know, and I see Herman here, we had this long-term discussions on to divest or not to divest, right? And there are good arguments for both cases, right? But we thought, and we decided to divest because we thought of three or four things. One, it sends a very strong message to the markets of where you stand, what your values and your principles are. Second, because we thought that divesting also help us on engagement, right? It's easier from our perspective to sit with sectors, as Jack was saying, guys, I will not invest in you if you don't do the right decisions, right? Because we believe that having 0.00000% of the stocks of a company doesn't have a bigger impact than not having anything but joining forces with somebody. So divesting was a very key part of our strategy. Also because, I don't know you, but we have scarce resources, right? we cannot engage with anybody the way we would like. So you have to channel your forces to engage and do the things that you can do. So that is why we divested, strong message, channel resources, focus, and also stay away from an asset that we don't like, right? It's not the only exclusion that we have. For example, we have exclusion of tobacco, we have exclusion from weapons, thermal coal, and this is yet another exclusion. Engagement, I explained, and engagement, I will link it to my other point about what can we do together, because we believe that engagement is not only directly with the companies that you can invest in, but it's joining other groups and magnifying our voices. So I'll come back to that. And then the third part of our strategy for net zero is investing in sustainable sources of energy, right? And we now have 5% of our portfolio is already invested in sustainable sources of energy. Half of it is solar, of course, and then the rest distributed around other sources. And we're doing it in all our asset classes, public equities, a fixed income as well, and private markets, including infrastructure. So those are the three pillars of our strategy, and we have to lead the way. Now, as some of you, or most of you probably are or were, we were lost in the beginning, right? We were lost on where to start. And there are, and Jake made reference to the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. I don't know how many of you know about this, or if not, and it is a group of asset owners. And there's also a Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, a Net Zero Banking Alliance, Net Zero Insurance Alliance. And what it does, these alliances, is it helps us that we're starting to learn of what others have already learned and to discuss things and be better at measuring, reporting, and tackling things, but also at engaging as a group, right? Because as I said, for us, the basis for engagement is joining groups of like-minded people that could help you magnify your voice. And you don't have to own any stock in order to have that impact on a sectorial basis, as Jake was saying, right? So for those of you that are starting the path or are in the middle of the path and you would like to get help on how to get to net zero with all the technology that has been developed, we're a group of, help me here, Jake, probably 50-something different asset
About
owners.
70 representing over 10 trillion.
Right, so it's massive. They know a lot. They can help you with technology, because what I'm seeing also is that there has been a proliferation of different groups that try to do the same, right? And by, once again, scarce resources, we all have scarce resources. And if we fragment those efforts, the impact will be less. So if we join our voices and we leverage on the knowledge that we all have been developing and the knowledge that these net zero alliances have, would be more beneficial. So I'm going to stop there.
Oh, no, thank you, Pedro. You know, great, and logical strategy. But if you reverse it, we often hear in the market about the transition. Are we going to be penalized by, we don't switch a light on and then switch it off? And one minute today we're not as friendly to the environment as we need to be. There's an expectation we're going to be penalized. It'd be good to get your views about how you're beginning to potentially think about the transition period and the framework around making a transition, because there's a lot of pressure out there that it should happen immediately, and we all know nothing happens immediately at best. So, and then also, divestment. Is there a more strategic way that divestment can be done? Because yes, you tick a box to say I've reduced the emissions in my portfolio because I'm no longer in that asset. But is someone else just going to be picking up that asset, and the world is in the same situation as a consequence to it? So is there a middle ground that you can divest to someone that maybe is more muscular in terms of engagement, that can take on that asset instead of just divesting? It'd be interesting to get your views.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that, because I think that your two questions are related, right? Because after thinking a lot, as I mentioned, we think that the middle ground is, so I told you, we divest from fossil fuel companies that are not doing anything to move to net zero, right? To transition. And we're investing in sustainable energies companies. But we're also, when we were developing our strategy, we are investing in those companies that are transitioning to a sustainable, to generating sustainable sources of energies, right? When we started doing that, and it's a methodology that I would be happy to share with you. It's of course imperfect and it could be improved, but we haven't found anything better yet. Because when you start analyzing these transitioning companies, right, and we all talk about this, having a plan is not enough because now everybody has a plan, right? And so that was our first thing. The companies have to have a plan, but the plan is not enough. Then there have to be actions because we've been talking about this for 10 years at least, or 8 years, whatever. So there should be more than a plan, also actions. How you measure actions? Well, first, by how much money they're putting into those projects that they're saying that they would be doing, right? So we measure investment in capex towards sustainable sources of energy, but also if you can see the decrease in the carbon emissions that they have been having. So basically, our criteria for keeping companies that are mainly, that their revenues mainly come from fossil fuels is if they are putting their money where their plans are and if they are showing improvements in the carbon emissions that they have. So we have, and to be honest, there's just a handful of companies that we are keeping investing, and I'm talking about fossil fuels. Those companies, it's a handful of them that are really, they have a solid plan, they're making the right decisions, and you can measure that they're decreasing their carbon emissions. The rest, for us, it's not valid. So we're being very, very tough. And again, to the point of engagement, yeah, we would love to have enough resources that we could engage with each one of these companies, of the thousands of companies that are out there, to become net zero. Because what I always tell is, for us, this 40% reduction was the easiest way, right? Because we just divested $2 billion, we decreased 40%. But the most difficult one will be the 60% remaining, because the 60% of carbon emissions in our portfolio comes from all the other companies, no? Cement companies, but also electric vehicle companies, and each one of them. So we prefer to devote most of the resources that we have to engage with all the rest of the companies to become net zero, because we put a lot of effort and a lot of analysis on fossil fuel companies, right? But if you take any index, let's take the ACWI index, right? Energy companies represent 4% of the index, right? Only 4% of the index. And we discuss hours and hours and hours about fossil fuels. And the question is, can't you find other investment alternatives that could give you the same or more return that those fossil fuel companies that represent only 4% of the index? Our answer was yes. And we are. Right now, we're having a better return of our portfolio without fossil fuels, not sacrificing anything. It's just 4% of the index. You adjust your index, so you measure your investment officers in a fair way, and then everybody happy. And then you focus on achieving the other 60% of carbon emissions that we haven't tackled yet.
Okay, fantastic. Before I come to Frederick, I know that we have our stewardship czar in Jake here. So I wonder if you have any views on what you've just heard.
I think what Pedro laid out is perfectly legitimate from a portfolio construction standpoint. I think with stewardship, one of the ideas we talk about in the future of investor engagement is, are you squeezing the balloon of climate risk within your portfolio? So if you squeeze it out of your portfolio, does it pop up somewhere else in a systemic risk standpoint? And that's not to say that you shouldn't be doing it from a portfolio construction standpoint, but I think one of the reasons that it's important to advocate for policy, regulatory, legislative change is that the actual alignment of the overall economy is in no small part determined by the rules of the game that are determining from a legislative, policy, economic incentive standpoint where the economic system is incentivized to go. So investors need to be just as intelligent about engaging on those topics as they are about aligning their own portfolio with long-term success. So I think it's not necessarily, I think that that's a very intelligent approach from a portfolio construction standpoint, and would also, and it is not necessarily at odds with a systemic stewardship standpoint, but it needs to be a both and.
Which takes us again to the importance of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, right?
Yeah.
Because that Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, they have a specific group engaging with policymakers in order to capture those things, right?
Can I add one point?
Please, it's a conversation.
This actually, people need to think about the whole thing with the more systemic ecosystem thinking. There was one very big sovereign wealth fund in Asia complained that they said the low carbon transition and net zero. And so the best way, you start to do carbon footprinting, assuming all your portfolio, both equity and fixed income, and this company has this much emission and it accounts to your own portfolio, the weighting. So you can do carbon intensity times the weighting of portfolio. You can see how thick your portfolio is, how concentrated like coffee. And so if you decide to pour more clean water, the carbon intensity of portfolio will improve. Or you decide to put more espresso, then it will be different. And then sovereign wealth fund complained that they set this goal without explaining the whole knowledge. What happened? A lot of the fund managers just sell the petrochemical and they move into banking shares. Because banks, the emission is low. And I said, no, you are going to get scope 3 problem very soon. Because if all your investee and bank borrowers, they don't care and they suffer, then you suffer. Like in the old days, you buy utility, telco, you can fall asleep. Even in pandemic, they make money for you. But then now you have to care in North Asheville, the West Coast at Rocky Mountain, or in South Asheville in Australia, whether the place have dry wind, big fast wind, and become fire. And so it's very important that we make this ESG, the responsible investment, into as a proper education to the team. Why we do this, rather than you have to do this, because they need to give you a KPI that I reduce. And now they all buy banking shares. To me, that's very crazy. So starting with calculating your own portfolio carbon footprinting, analyze what are your top 60 emission come from. It should be less than 20% of your portfolio. And then you expand to 80% of your portfolio. You can focus on materiality. Who are the big position? Who are the position contribute to your big the majority of your portfolio? It's not that difficult.
Yeah, and it would seem that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, please go.
Well, just one other systemic real economy point that I think is underappreciated when we talk about oil and gas, that begs the question of needing to revise how we think about both engagement and divestment, is that only 10 to 15%, depending on how you set the bounds, of the oil and gas market is Western traded oil and gas companies. So I don't think Saudi Aramco cares if I try to engage or divest from them. That's a much more complex question that we don't necessarily have an answer for in terms of the vast majority of that market in the real economy being state-owned enterprises or other state-owned affiliated institutions.
And I want to promote this idea.
And you're welcome to jump in anytime, Frederick. Sorry.
To me, emission is guilt. It's not crime. We need cement, glass, steel to build this building. So the purpose of engagement is to help them transition rather than making them disappear. So please care about them more, care about their future, and they know you come with good intention, and they see the pressure. No ESG, no business. No ESG, no money. If you lose your order and you don't have financial institution to support you, sorry, you'll become an SME. So we need them to do transition rather than we want to kill them.
Yeah, fantastic. So, Frederick, you've got a lot of data that sort of underpins, I think, most of these things that have been said, and data that sort of will talk to the things that haven't been said. So, over to you.
I'd like to answer your question. Your question was,
What about net zero and fiduciary responsibility? And I think it's a good question for a lot of people because, as we all know, at the COP26, something unique happens. Investors representing $130 trillion took that commitment. So 10 trillion for the asset owners, 65 and 55 for the asset managers and the banks. And $130 trillion is such a big number that I think the only way to make it almost concrete is to say that 0.01% of that, 0.01%, is $13 billion. So when you have this big number, I would say, in the space, it means something. So all these people took that commitment. Is that part of their fiduciary responsibility? That was your question. And here, in parallel, we can see something fascinating happening with governments. In 2018, almost none of the governments had commitments to be carbon neutral. And when we read the last IEA report, they said last year it was now representing 70% of the emission. And it's slightly outdated, it's more about 80%. So, and some countries are even legally binding. It was one of your questions as well. It's about Canada, it's about California, UK, Europe, South Korea, Japan, and so on. And where do we come here? We can say that the world is more on the rise of emissions. When we do the math back of the envelope, it's about an increase by 50% of the emissions by 2050. And all these governments that have taken a commitment to be carbon neutral, it means actually to decrease the emissions by about 90%. So we are facing a situation where the world is on the road for plus 50% and the commitments are about minus 90%. So we have never seen such a gap. So what does it mean concretely? It means that policymakers will, sorry with my hands, but will, with a PowerPoint it helps, but so let's say it's a PowerPoint. So it means that the likelihood that policymakers will bring the upper bound towards the lower one is pretty high. Is that already happening? The answer is yes. If you look at what's happening in Europe, the ETS market, that is a way to control the volume of CO2 that Europe is allowing to be in the atmosphere, the price has shifted from 5 to 95 over the past 5 years. How many times have you seen a tax being multiplied by almost 20? And they keep on pushing the envelope. They've said, now that we are legally binding to be carbon neutral by 2050, how are we to channel that policy through economy, through this mechanism? So they say clearly, we have an objective and we have a mechanism that is to control the volume of CO2 and through this ETS market. So what does it mean for an investor? It means that if they do nothing, the volume of CO2 into portfolios is to increase massively, and the materiality of the risk is increasing as well because taxes are mounting. So when you have a risk that is increasing in volumes and in materiality, to answer your question, it's maybe part of your fiduciary responsibility to handle it. And then you have two possibilities. Either you say, okay, fine, I will hedge it. I will buy all the ETS markets around the world. At S&P, we have a product for that. And or you can as well decide to reduce the volume of CO2 in your portfolios, because by reducing the volume of CO2, by definition, you're reducing the likelihood to be impacted by the taxes. And here that leads, because as time is flying, to a paper that has been published in the Financial Analyst Journal. That's why I think that not being an asset owner, I've been invited here, in the Financial Analyst Journal, that say that can we find a way that is very straightforward to reduce the volume of CO2 into portfolios. And for that, with Patrick Bolton from Columbia University and Marcin Kakpersit from Imperial College, we published this paper that is very straightforward. We said, what do we know? We know what IPCC says. IPCC said in 2021 that we, the planet, if we want to be carbon neutral by 2050, the famous objective, we only have 300 gigatons of CO2. Period. Cannot emit more. In 2022, it means reduce the volume of CO2
by 12% per year. And at S&P, we have announced 2 weeks ago the launch of 5 indices that are exactly doing that. We take the carbon footprint of the S&P 500 and all the others, and gradually we will reduce the volume of CO2 of the indices in a way that mirrors what must be achieved at the planet's level. So all the investors have here a product that is net zero. The good news is that the tracking error is low, the number of stocks is high, and so on. There is the bad news. Nothing to do with us, but with the planet. The point is that the carbon budget shrinks. Year after year, we are consuming it. So if an investor is to wait, then as the carbon budget shrinks, the decarbonization rate increases, and at high speed, because the minus 12% becomes minus 20% per year in 2025 and minus 47% per year in 2028, meaning impossible. So, well, we are very glad to have launched that because that's the very first product, to our knowledge, in the industry that conveys exactly the message of IPCC last year. IPCC last year said to humanity, we can still solve climate change, but the window opportunity is closing very fast. If we don't take action now, it's too late.
So the climate clock is material.
Yeah, and here for the first time, you have a financial product that conveys exactly that message that says for the investors entering into the product in 2022, it's minus 12. Bad news, if you wait for whatever reasons in 2025, the budget will have been utilized. And so it will be minus 20 as an example.
Fantastic. Well, that's an excellent segue into the next point that I want to ask our asset owners. Interestingly, Jake, I was actually in Berlin earlier this year at the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance meeting, and there were lots of different discussions. And again, we used the vernacular, speed, scale. And I asked, what do you mean by scale? Can someone quantify what that means or what it looks like, and maybe give a similar answer around speed? So that's what I'd like. Hopefully, our asset owners here to be able to give us a perspective about mobilizing capital at scale, deploying that capital at speed is very aligned to the net zero objective and strategy. So I'd really be interested to get starting with Jake and then going through to Sophia, Pedro, and then Sophia, just to get your views on how within your own institution, if you were asked that question, what do you mean by scale? How, and how do you anticipate you can execute that in a speedy fashion aligned to the climate science? It'd be great to get your views, maybe starting with you, Jake.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to be speaking more from the stewardship engagement side because that's where I spend the majority of my time. But when it comes to speed and scale, I think an example that we can pull from COP26 is the need to really aggressively manage methane. That was something whereby, although there were some disappointing elements to COP26, one of the kind of silver lining moments was a real consensus around, in order to keep any sort of net zero goal in mind, there's a need to very aggressively manage methane. And that's a topic where, in terms of speed, there's a clear imperative to do it immediately. And the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership is one of the clear, science-based, really rigorous metrics that we think has the right element of speed and urgency attached to it. When it comes to scale, once again, I think it needs to be at a systemic policy level. So what does that look like in a US context? Well, the Environmental Protection Agency came out with a rulemaking comment letter on methane disclosure. Westpath submitted a letter talking about what we needed from that, what we saw as important in the speed and scale of transitioning the economic system to management of methane. But to Sophia's point, part of what we were trying to do was eat our own cooking and show the companies that we engage with that this is a topic that we are taking seriously. So we sent our letter to multiple Climate Action 100 plus companies that we engage with, And two of the largest oil and gas majors in the US actually then went and submitted constructive comments to the EPA saying this is something that we align with and think should be managed aggressively. So you're not always going to be focused on, we might disagree with some of those companies when it comes to scope 3, but for the speed and scale question, and to Sophia's point, there are common ground in these engagements whereby we're shifting the system if we can show them that this is in our collective best interests to move forward on.
Okay. And the Inflation Act and bill and all these things that are happening right here in this country, I understand that one of them is a bill focused on speed for permitting, for example, just understanding the psychology of being able to do things at speed. I think we're seeing it in Europe with the Fit for 55 approach, where asset owners are simply saying to governments, you're pushing us, but there's not an enabling environment to be able to procure and bring these new technologies and projects to market, at pace. So it seems to be trickling across. So that's really interesting. Sophia, same question to you. Oh, no, sorry.
It's me. No, I think it's a good question. I think, first of all, if you were an early investor setting a net zero target, you did it in 2019. It's quite recent. It's really difficult. It's decarbonizing the global economy. It's not an easy thing to do. And even though we need to solve it by 2030, it's going to just technically and getting people on board be very, very difficult. So I think speed and scale is good. It's good with new initiatives. It's good to be pushed, but there needs to be a recognition that we also need to have time to actually look at what we can do and where we can have the largest impact. I think in terms of where we can speed up or scale up is to pick the low-hanging fruits first while we make the longer-term plan for the more difficult things. So it's starting to engage. It's looking at whether they're across different asset classes, whether there are opportunities. So we have infrastructure portfolio is increasingly just very focused on renewable energy, on charging infrastructure, on on building out or helping to decarbonize the economy. It's looking at our real assets portfolio generally in terms of land use and talking to our tenants. And so we have all these different levers. It's talking to our managers. It's looking at whether there are any opportunities in the private market space or whether we can find any opportunities even in the listed space in terms of funds or funds who are actually trying to actively target decarbonization. And then I think to Jake's point, policy engagement is incredibly important. And because of our role in the UK, we do have access. We're a relatively small asset owner, but we do have access and we are listened to, especially in the UK. So I think using that voice to push regulation where it's needed or push other asset owners and some of our peers and then also just collaborating with others. Climate Action 100 Plus is probably the most successful engagement initiative because it's collaboration. You come with one voice, with a clear set of targets, with a clear set of expectations, which makes it a lot easier for companies, because what we hear from managers as well as companies is if you have 100 different investors asking 100 different things, it becomes very difficult for them to implement. So the collaboration part in terms of aligning expectations, I think, will also help in speeding up.
Fantastic. And I'm going to come back to you because I think when we talk about scale, one of the things we often hear from companies is, if the government is talking about scale, obviously we need to do things at an unprecedented level and scope. But we've got antitrust laws which are counterintuitive to being able to do things at scale when companies need to conglomerate and work together to be able to do things that are going to have a much larger impact. So we're seeing a number of different groups now also thinking about the antitrust law and legal dimension. Do you come across any of that?
I think I don't have a
couple of levels down, is it?
Yeah, I don't have a case study of it, but I do think that kind of brings it back to Jake's point around policy engagement.
Yep.
So it's not just policy engagement around asking policymakers for companies to set targets.
Mhm.
It's identifying what actual detailed regulation, if we have if we're able to identify specific regulation like antitrust law
Mhm.
or like planning permissions or things like that, that actually put a barrier to decarbonization, then that should be part of our engagement efforts, policymakers, that we can see a barrier there. So I think and then I do think there's some path dependency or kind of perceived risk in some of these things, that you're not used to doing it, so therefore we're probably not allowed to do it, instead of like testing whether it actually, looking at whether it actually is against the regulation. Because I think it's the same with the divestment. It can be a good tool and it's the right thing for some people, but you will have advisors or other investors who are like, oh, that's against our fiduciary duty, without having thought about it for more than 30 seconds. So I think there's also space to actually explore whether things are actually against fiduciary duty or other regulations.
I saw you lean forward and nodding there, Jake.
Well, just very briefly, I think investors have a unique role to be a convener for sectoral conversations in a way that companies, it can almost offer them some degree of cover, because they're not kind of coming together as a cabal to have a conversation. Investors are saying, we want this sectoral conversation, we want other people involved. And then investors can put forth standards or policy engagements that they see as in their systemic best interest.
Any one big catalytic tectonic shift policy that you'd put on the table now, given all of the meetings and the ecosystems that you're in, that you tell policymakers, this is really going to change the game for scale or speed?
I will answer it in an annoying way. No.
No. All right.
I think, I think it's an incredibly complex problem, and it will be really complex to decarbonize. And I think there are definitely policies that matter more than others, but there's just not one solution that's going to get us there. Not in terms of.
And it depends who you're asking, I presume.
Sorry?
And it depends who you're asking.
Yeah.
And Frederick?
One word, we all know about the carbon disclosure, and in the paper we promote the idea of having the carbon forward-looking disclosure. Like we have the earnings guidance, we should have the carbon guidance, meaning that corporates should disclose their forecast for the next 3 years in terms of volumes of CO2. Volkswagen already knows the car that it will sell. Total already knows what kind of oil they will sell and so on. And so if we could have that forward-looking data, then we could plug it into whatever models, investment process, and so on, and already reward the corporates that are on the right trajectory and the other way around. So similarly to earnings guidance, carbon guidance.
Carbon guidance. Pedro? And we now need some UN wisdom.
And no, it's probably more simple than that, because we're also investors, right? And we have to be ready to put the money in the things that we want. So, for example, I mentioned already that we have 5% of our portfolio, that's $4 billion, already in sustainable sources of energy. We have an allocation that has to be filled for infrastructure projects only on sustainable related energy projects. So that's another $4 billion. So that's what by not being distracted on transitioning or not transitioning and all that, and in our role of investors, so we're putting fast money and sizable money to do that, right? And avoiding greenwashing, right? Because if you go sustainable from the beginning, you avoid greenwashing, right? And we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah.
We manage resources.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because the first, before our panel, obviously you had the interview with Linda Rothschild and Hiro Mizuno. And Hiro Mizuno, as we know, is the former GIPF CIO and CEO, but also the architect of the universal owner concept. And effectively, this is really what we are looking at in many respects. We are universal owners of the market. How can we leverage that? Because that is effectively an incumbent delivery of scale, if it's coordinated in a way through organizations, perhaps in structures like whether Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, ILN, SMI, your good consortium and the like. So Sophia, good to get your views with that in mind.
I'm very conscious on time because the clock is not
Ticking.
right. Yeah, so how much time do we have
Yes.
left?
No, please.
Okay.
I'm being managed.
It's not working, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, that's why
I was sitting here yesterday looking at that, wondering whether it was me or the clock. So you're good.
Okay. But first of all, I think if the law is outdated, we should change it.
Right.
In Taiwan in 2018, we changed the corporate law that originally the corporation maximize ROE, but we add a clause that without hurting social environment. So that's basic. If you want to collect people together, do right thing, and the original law was to prevent corporate become bigger and bigger and become naughty and creating various gap, wealth gap, any gap. Yeah. So I think if it's a good thing, we should change the law. And then, net zero definitely need government. So besides engaging government, we have been engaging government for about 5 years. And now, myself is also the advisor to Premier Office, National Development Council, and merger acquisition. And I'm also the member of Future Earth Hub in Taipei. So this think the young investor, if you care about the world, don't be constrained by our role as a company. So today there are 84 countries which represent about 80% of global greenhouse gas emission already. They communicate on the net zero carbon neutral target. In Asia, there are 15 countries do so, including Korea and Japan already put that in law. Taiwan, we commit to net zero by 2050. In late March, the government also announced net zero pathway, starting with several industry sectors which are more related to Europe, EU, what's it called? CBAM, the border
carbon
yes,
adjustment
yes,
border, carbon
yes.
border.
Yeah,
Yes,
so you were asking about the speed and scale. I think there were a couple of things we can think of. Number one, if it's something global standard, global trend like methane, you mentioned, or the coal. So our bank stopped lending to any coal-fired power plant and trading and transportation. So by 2027, the bank will have zero coal power-fired loan. Where for the investor, because we have group asset under management, 400 billion US, we need investment portfolio. So if you invest in a coal-related company, they must have transition plan, or you just don't do any new investment until the bond is expired and find any time to divest. And then I start to care more about strand asset. As Sophie mentioned, that by 2023, there will be no new investment into some areas. This year, I start to feel very bigger and bigger stress on strand asset to broader fossil related. If at the end of the day, only yourself invest in this company, you are the one who can keep doing reinvestment. And so there is the common pressure on responsible investment is making the strand asset one more and followed by one and more. So following the global trend is not that difficult. And then we need to understand the constraint of every country. For example, Taiwan, 97% of energy depends on import. So I will think it's okay for the government to shift from coal to gas while we are finding new solution. Korea and Japan are the same. So respecting every market's constraint is also very important. And then by participating in SBT, IE100, TCFD, Climate Action 100 Plus, you can start to learn more about scientific toolkits. That is very important. Without analytic tools, we don't know where we are. And no tool is perfect. Don't start time complaining about it. It's better than nothing. And then you start to analyze. You have some foundation for internal discussion. And by engagement program, we push others. And there's no reason we don't do a good job. So we will start to push ourselves more. And then the greenhouse gas reduction, because the learning curve of every country is different, you can easily find more opportunity and constraint and respond accordingly. And then the transition, we are seeing some transition in transition. We are seeing EU now allowing nuclear power, gas as clean energy. Korea, new leader said they are going to rediscuss nuclear power plant. We now have this green inflation, blame all the green. There are always two different groups try to fight against each other. Take this as a temporary pause. Yes, maybe we haven't thought about energy security. Yeah, let's work on that. So you may move 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but as long as it's net accretion, it's always worthwhile for us to think about solution. And lastly, ESG is not just about net zero. They have more and more than just the climate issue that we should care. The whole world, when you talk about public-private partnership, now in Europe, the blended finance, it's very popular already because the development funds, development bank have so there's just a ceiling for their funds available. They can give up their return to you. They can do guarantee for you. By that, we can do the blended finance because the transition project and emerging markets, they need help. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we're just going to move, because I know that we are limited on time. So we're going to have this question, and hopefully, if people in the room have a microphone, and there are no microphones. Okay, great. So we will continue to talk. COP. Oh yes, please.
Sorry, I just had one quick. I think the best policy. Sorry.
Oh yes, good.
The global carbon tax.
Global carbon tax.
In its absence, it will be a slightly strange patchwork of policies. I think to Sophia's point around net zero not being the only ESG issue, I think so when we look at systemic risks as nature degradation, inequality, and climate change,
yes,
while net zero addresses climate change, they're all interlinked and they're all interdependent. We can't solve climate change without solving for just transition.
Yes.
It will just create too much pushback. We can't, climate change without protecting nature is a bit meaningless as well.
Yes.
Because of also Sophia's point around using natural resources and kind of nature. So.
Now that you've just sort of touched on that really, really important point that we were actually going to go to, which is the sort of the COP27 focus. And I hope everyone's registered and accredited, has accommodation, unless you'll join me on the beach. But if that's not an option. COP27, an African COP. We know that there's going to be a lot of focus on emerging markets, developing countries, the ability for asset owners to exponentially increase assets to that part of the world. And I know that Sophia, under the church mission, you've taken an approach on SDG 10 on inequality, and there's a task force on inequality financial reporting, and there's the just transition. There are many different ways now that asset owners are coming to begin to look at this. So I'm very interested to get asset owners' views on what you're planning and thinking and would like to see at COP27, and how you intend to address increasing allocations to emerging markets and developing countries. Maybe, Sophia, you want to finish, and then we'll go to Jake, and then we'll finish off with other colleagues.
Yeah, I think so. In terms of COP27, I think so we don't have a large exposure to emerging markets
Yet.
And I think it is challenging for us for our investment strategy. If you have an investment strategy that allows for that, that is incredibly important. I think where we might have more exposures through supply chains within our other exposures. I think in terms of COP, I think loss and damage needs to be addressed. I think from an asset owner perspective, we've made all of these commitments, and there are a lot of big meetings and a lot of big announcements. We also just need to sit down and do the work. And then for COP27, if policymakers can actually sit and loss and damage, or the helping of developing countries transition, I think is incredibly important. We can't, to the point around net zero is not net zero unless the entire world gets to net zero. Yeah. So some of the other bits need to be solved.
Yes.
And if this can be a COP for that. And also we didn't get to talk about the energy crisis at the moment, but in terms of messaging, this kind of the just transition and energy affordability and transitioning in a fair way needs to be the messaging. It kind of, because I think it will resonate better and it will mobilize action.
Yeah, I think I completely agree, and I think the challenge is that a lot of people don't even understand the COP process. Yeah. So people actually think that COP27 is the event, when in fact it's rather the presidency. So the COP27, so Africa will have the presidency of the COP process for 12 months before it hands over to COP28, November next year in the UAE, which is actually going to be the big stocktake, which is going to be a more strategic and bigger systemic architectural change meeting. That's why we think that the COP27 process, looking at loss and damages, looking at just energy transition, climate finance, long-term institutional capital flows, is going to be really important. But Jake, I know that you're right in the heart of those discussions, so it'd be really great to get your view.
Yeah, I think I get excited about blended finance opportunities. We need to be really practical in looking at the energy transition and supply and demand dynamics. Terms are thrown around like that solar energy is cheaper than coal, but that doesn't really take into account intermittency and storage issues. So once you're talking about affordable, reliable, consistent energy, there's a clear-eyed rational reason why countries in Africa or other emerging markets might still be building coal plants. And we need to be really practical about that. And I think blended finance is one exciting opportunity for that. I think also, hopefully, legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act continues to drive down costs in energy supply through things like battery storage investment, or investments that are being made in diesel engines, decarbonization that can then allow emerging market countries to leapfrog. But I do think that financing of that investment piece is not there yet, and so I hope there's some focus on that.
Yeah, and it's quite strange that's the case, because it's almost. Someone was telling me about a meeting that they participated in the UK last week, and it was a group of, it was actually interfaith groups, investors were there, plus some other British pension funds. And they were saying that when they heard the term emerging markets in developing countries, people just said, I have a mental block. I have a mental block. But when you begin to look at the exajoules and the natural capital being the new currency of the world, and Africa has 5 times more exajoules than Europe, 4 times more than other continents, it's really got to be a new narrative around the investment proposition. And if you then begin to look at the critical minerals going into green technologies, we already know that there's only 10% of the lithium required for batteries for the next 25 years, let alone the next 25 years and the next 25 years. So I think that strategic mindset focus, it's a different investment narrative. So we always talk about it in terms of, if only 50% of the African continent has been geologically tested for some of these minerals and they can be extracted responsibly, that is going to be a game changer for the world. And it's going to be a game changer for investors if we can reverse engineer this, extract raw materials, and then begin to add value, then evacuate some of the finished products using the things like the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I think it's a lot of education still needs to happen in that respect, but the value, the investment case and the investment value proposition, because of the natural capital endowment, is quite phenomenal. But I know, Pedro, you wanted to come in.
That is why my biggest expectation from this COP is to see the blooming of the African Green Infrastructure Bank.
Exactly. We're with you on that. Absolutely. I mean, all the asset owners have come together. What Pedro is talking about is a Pan-African version of the UK Green Investment Bank, where asset owners are beginning to pool capital and work with governments to co-create investable and bankable transactions using a universal owner mentality. So to Sophia's point, the supply chains will be the off-takers. So we're no longer investing in foreign currency and the project earns revenues in local currency, when there could be green hydrogen and those other assets and opportunities being acquired, and those project revenues now become foreign currency. So there are different dynamics for those who are prepared to sort of get past the block, I suppose. But it's not easy. I mean, if that's what we've been cultured.
If I can add a point, I think the willingness to learn new technology and the willingness to learn other people's needs is the basic. I brought the One Development Fund to meet all the banks in my country and some Asian banks, and they always come up with the credit risk is hard to justify, the return is not visible, blah, blah, blah. But if you think about today, banks and insurance company, asset management, we back the large company who have the ESG and some dividend yield and then passive investment. We are moving this capital into company who are already very strong. But the reason 100 years ago, why do we set up a bank, financial institution, is to apply to move the money surplus into the money shortage. Mm-hmm. Today we go opposite. We are asking Microsoft, Apple, TSMC to borrow more at very low rate. We don't bother to understand the similar case like 30 years ago every great company, we start with SME. And so I try to urge the world financial institution, can we think about our original mission? Can we change the way we do traditional banking? If today we cannot give them money, can we at least invest a team helping them, teach them how to become bankable and investable?
Yeah.
I think that's very basic. And by willing to learn, we will understand it's not that bad. With the credit enhancement from development bank, development funds, and sovereign wealth fund, it's become more possible than before.
Yes, and I completely agree. I think it sort of reminds me of that saying about as long-term investors, we need to be learners, remain open-minded. And that saying goes, the learned, those who perhaps are a bit closed-minded, the learners will inherit the earth, whereas the learned will be beautifully equipped to manage a world that no longer exists. And we are transitioning. And this is the dynamic that I think we're seeing geopolitically as well as economically. And I think asset owners having that long-term perspective are very well placed to provide that leadership. But I'm minded that we are about to come to a close for this session. And in my capacity as the chair of the CFA New York Society's Asset Owners Council, I have the responsibility through this forum that we host each year to really use at least the panel that I'm on, and hopefully the other moderators will use it in a similar way, to identify a project, to identify an area that the CFA New York Society's Asset Owners Council can add some value to an area of the market that would require industry leadership. So I'm going to go, perhaps let's start with you, Frederick, and then let Pedro bookend us. But out of this panel, out of the net zero asset owners, actions, responsibilities, needs, what would your two priority areas be, or recommendations to the Asset Owners Council to take forward and try to champion? And then please, just come back to me, each speaker.
We observe what has been successful over the past 10 years in terms of financial innovation. There was always an asset owner at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
AP4 in 2011 initiated the first prototypes of low carbon indices. FRR, so AP4 was the Swedish public pension fund. And then in 2014, FRR, the French public pension fund, decided to shift this prototype towards the mainstream. You have named Hiro Mizuno at GPIF that shifted the entire debate on engagement and so on. I could mention IFC that has started a totally new business model in terms of blended finance, using its balance sheet to unlock investment capabilities in emerging markets. So here you have 4 examples where you have an asset owner that identified a problem. How do I invest into equities with a time issue? How do I get engagement? How do I channel money towards infrastructures in emerging markets and so on? A very narrowed problem. And they did 3 things at each time. They dedicated their money. They put some money on the table. They dedicated resources. And they decided to partner with the others in order to have an impact on society. So you ask me what will be my recommendation, is that the asset owners are taking a problem.
What, sorry?
Are taking a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the lack of coverage of physical risks? Is that the lack of forward-looking data? Is that whatever? And they dedicate money, time,
what would your
resources.
one recommendation be in terms of where those pooled resources should be focused, if you were to pick one problem to solve?
For me, it would be the
data.
The forward-looking data.
Forward-looking data. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Frederick. Jacob?
I think asset owners, including myself, and we're having this conversation at the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, have more work to do to figure out how to evaluate and integrate systemic stewardship into selection, appointment, and monitoring processes for our managers. So I think there's lots of room to do more work on that topic.
Excellent. Thank you. Sophia?
I would agree with Jake, but I also think practical case studies from asset owners in similar situations and how they've actually, it could be a bit intangible, And I think a lot of people will have mental blocks for net zero. So having those kind of very practical step by step.
Oh, good idea. Thank you.
Number one, make ESG integration detailed analysis as a basic when you choose an asset manager. Don't tell me they follow PRI. Show me your integration details. Number two, offer study program and training education for our members and people we give the mandate. This will including circular economy, climate tech, all the new trends, and case study is very, very useful because they like to benchmark others. Number three, remove ESG washing and greenwashing. It's not hard to define who is closer to ESG washing. We have to think about investment return with impact. We manage money on general public's behalf, and therefore we should earn money for them and earn their respect. As I say, no ESG, no business, and no ESG, no money. And corporate need to make sure no ESG, no future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I really like that point that you've highlighted then about the greenwashing, because, we find as asset owners, if we identify whether it's a manager or an entity that's greenwashing, we stay away. But we don't inform our fellow asset owner colleague who might not be as, alive to that one, and then an investment gets made. So the ability, I suppose, at an industry level to be able to democratize and share that information, so that asset owners, we can, as a collective, can identify greenwashers and potentially help them, of course. But no, great point. Finally, last word to you, Pedro.
I think that the Sophias have just spoken, right? And they are the collection of wisdom, and they supported Jake's initiative. I think that asset managers are a key player for us, no? Asset owners. So integrating ESG, or I don't know how you phrase it, Sophia, would be a very nice thing.
Excellent. With that, perfectly on time, I would hope. So thank you, panel. Please, everybody, big round of applause and thank them for their great wisdom. And thank you for being a good audience. Okay. Thank you.
Speakers, right now we're going to be moving to a 10-minute break, and we will return with the panel in 10 minutes. So thank you all, and enjoy this break.